Do you struggle to get the bass right when you are mixing? This is probably the biggest problem that people new to mixing face. In this video, I'll explain why and then give you several ways that can solve this problem. Low frequency sounds have long wavelengths, which means it takes them a long time for one cycle of the wave to complete. A 60 Hz wave has a wavelength of about 18 feet or 5.5 meters. So if that was a pure sine wave, just to do one revolution, to do one cycle, that would need over 5 meters of distance to be able to complete it. Chances are you are sitting about 1 meter away from your speakers, so you're only going to hear a fraction of that waveform. Compared to a 6000 Hz waveform, that only needs 0.2 feet to complete a cycle, or 5 centimeters. I should just add as well that we don't always just hear the waveform like in a complete cycle. When it comes to these low frequencies, our bodies feel them and also can sense the changes in the air pressure, the changes in vibrations. So that's one way that we can still hear them. And what happens is when that wavelength is going to hit that back wall or any of the other surrounding walls, we are going to hear a reflection. So we are going to hear it. We're just not going to hear it exactly as it comes out. So that will start introducing standing waves and room modes, which we'll go on to in a second. And if you think, oh, well, I don't need 15-foot long headphones, how comes I can hear the bass really clearly in headphones? Well, that is because the vibrations are happening from the speaker, the diaphragm in your headphones, and they're almost being transferred directly through vibration straight into your eardrum. Another reason why it's hard to hear the bass is the room you're in. Most rooms do not have a flat frequency response. It's not like the sound coming out your speakers comes exactly to you as it is. It's getting shaped by the room. Think of the room as a guitar body. It's got a resonance to it. Think of being inside a giant acoustic guitar. That room is going to resonate at different frequencies depending on the geometry. What this means is some frequencies are going to be boosted while some are going to be cut. Whilst your bass might be coming out the speakers, certain frequencies in that bass might be getting jacked up as high as 10 dBs, 20 dBs in some cases, or they might be cut and you might be hearing a big trough in your bass when really it's not there at all. You're just hearing the room mode affecting that. Does that make sense? So rarely newcomers have a really great sounding room. Even this one I'm in, which has been treated acoustically, is not perfect. I've got bass traps in the corners, got bass traps at the back, I've got diffusers behind me, I've got diffuser in front of me, but everything I've done does not change the geometry of the room. The room is slightly too narrow, the ceiling slightly too low to be perfect acoustically. So what this means is I have to know my room really well to know that there's a certain dip in certain frequencies or a certain peak at a certain frequency, so that when I'm mixing, I don't make a mistake by adding too much 50 Hertz, and that's because there's a dip in 50 Hertz in my sound. So that when someone at the other end listens to their track, they'll be like, oh, that 50 Hertz is really loud. You see the problem. So another tip here is to test your room and figure out how your room sounds. You can do this with systems like ARC from IK Multimedia. There's many others. What this means is your room has an EQ setting, if you like. And here you can see what mine looks like before and after the ARC-free correction system. You can see before there are some pretty big peaks and troughs in this room, and that's with acoustic treatment. So although I'm very much aware of the problem frequencies in this room, I will often check my low end on headphones. And this is another tip. I would encourage you to get some headphones with a good low response, such as these, the Sennheiser HD650s. So far, mixing on these, my bass has translated well. So this is one of the reasons that people struggle to mix bass. Their listening position, their listening environment is playing tricks on them. It's painting a picture that isn't actually there. For this reason, I often recommend beginners to get a better pair of headphones before they splash out and get some good speakers, because at least a good pair of headphones, one, it will be less expensive than good speakers, but two, it's going to minimize, it's going to cut out the room affecting your sound. There are problems with mixing on headphones as well, which you need to be aware of, like balancing reverbs and things. You get a bit too close to the sound, but I think that's easier to mitigate against rather than a room that's kind of twisting your hearing. And next, your ears aren't bass magnets. Your ears, they aren't designed to hear bass frequencies. Our ears respond to different frequencies differently. It takes more energy, more SPL, more sound pressure level, more volume to hear some frequencies than it does others. Let me show you on this chart. These are called equal loudness contours, or Fletcher Munson curves. What this basically shows is how loud something has to be for it to be perceived at the same volume by the listener. So you see all these low frequencies here They need to have a lot more volume, a lot more power in order to be able to hear them at the same level or the same perceived level as these mid-range and higher frequencies. The other main takeaway is that our ears are most sensitive here around 3 to 4 kilohertz. So we can use that to our advantage, but we have to be careful because if you boost too much 3 to 4K, then what you get is often a harsh, irritating, or even painful sounding mix. So if you want something to sound a bit louder, you can boost this area, but just don't overdo it. I always think these curves weirdly look like an ear as well if you just rotate it 90 degrees. I don't know. Okay, so that's some of the reasons why you can't hear your bass accurately when you're mixing, but what can we do about it? Here are a few tips. If you're like most people, you're probably sitting a meter or meter and a half away from your speakers. What you can do whilst you're mixing is slide to the back of the room where you have a better understanding of what's going on in the low end. You can also stand in the doorway, and this will also allow you to hear the bass a little bit more evenly. You might also want to flick between a reference track here to check how full, how powerful, how loud the bass sounds in their song in the same listening position, and then you can adjust accordingly. The chances are yours is too loud because you can't hear it so well when you're right in front of the speakers, so you're turning it up, but then when you're at the back of the room, you're like, oh wow, there's way too much bass. This is what often happens. Another point that I already mentioned is to use headphones. Headphones make it a lot easier to gauge the loudness and the level of the bass in your mix. Getting some good, relatively flat mixing headphones makes a big difference here. If you're boosting some frequencies in your bass to make it more audible, don't necessarily just boost the fundamental, the first frequency. Have a look at the second, third, fourth, fifth harmonics and maybe boost those instead. Those will fall a bit more in the mid-range and you'll be able to perceive them more because, well, we can hear the mid-range better. In the mid-range, we get more of a sense of an instrument's character, tonal quality. Whereas from the fundamental, we get more of the initial note, the pitch of the note often, but the character kind of comes more out in that mid-range. If you refer back to that Fletcher Munson curve, you'll realize that it's really difficult for us to hear things under 100 hertz. Our hearing doesn't work very well there. So trying to boost that a lot is a losing battle because you'll also run out of headroom. Whereas our ears are a lot more sensitive, say 1K, 2K, 3K, 4K. If you boost some of the bass sounds in that area, then that's going to cut through the mix a little bit more. By now, I'm sure you will have come across masking. Well, masking is a reason you probably can't hear your bass too well as well. If you're using microphones or you're using some samples that haven't been cleaned up, make sure you cut out that really low stuff, 20, 30, 40 hertz. There's nothing you really need down there apart from maybe a bit of weight in the kick drum and the bass. You can also take this a step further and cut some of the low mid-range out of certain instruments, maybe some guitars, maybe some pads, but don't do too much because then your mix will lack power and can start to sound a little thin. But if you've cleared up the low end in your other tracks, then there should be more room for that bass to occupy. Next, what you can do is look for the attack of the bass. This normally sits on a bass guitar around 1000 hertz, and you can EQ this up, you can boost this. But when you start to boost it, you should hear more of the kind of clickiness of the bass coming through. It might vary as well if you're on a synth bass, but just look for where you kind of get that more attacky, clicky, toppiness of the bass. And if you boost that with EQ, that has a better chance of it cutting through the mix. And therefore you'll be able to hear your bass a little bit clearer. It will translate into other systems a bit better. And if you've got a bass that lacks any sort of mid-range, what you can do is use saturation to add in some new harmonics based off of what harmonic content is already in your bass. So sometimes you might just see that your bass only really goes up to 200, 300 hertz. This happens quite often with synth bass, but if you apply some distortion, some saturation, you can create those new harmonics, and this will add more mid-range to the bass sound by adding in new overtones, new material. And this will be more in the mid-range and therefore be more audible across multiple systems. So there you have it. There's a load of tips that will help you make your bass sound better when you're mixing. And if you enjoyed this video, then YouTube suggests you watch this one too, because it's a banger, apparently. Thanks for watching. See you later.